All right, today we're going to move into the book of First Samuel. Um, I want to do some reviewing of not just events that have taken place, but also a review of just quickly the purpose of our study, and that is not necessarily to go through precept by precept, verse by verse through the scriptures and dissect each one, nor to pull out every single spiritual principle that is there. Specifically, what we're doing in this study is going through the scriptures and highlighting and following the thread of God's eternal purpose throughout the scriptures. And so, as it turns out, that is currently right now throughout the history of the nation of Israel and the many characters within the context of that people, both in the early times with the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even through the beginning in creation, Adam and Eve, but also now through a nation and through whether that be prophets or kings. We just went through Judges, and then also Ruth. We saw some highlights there, some specific lives, and how God's purpose continued on through that. One thing that we're seeing develop is not only a further understanding and revelation of who and manifestation of God himself. What's interesting is that as God reveals more of who he is, and he has done that even in his names, in the expression of his name. He has also done it in the revealing of his purpose. So the revealing of God's name, which is pointing at his character and his ways, is paralleled with, it literally works right alongside with the declaration or the revelation of his purposes for mankind. So we know that in the true essence of the gospel, that God's purpose was to create for himself a people, a family, with whom he could fellowship and impart his life too, that they may live and walk in his ways. And so we see the further development of that when he calls a people out to be his own, when he gives them the law by which to live, so that through the law a certain way of life might be produced in a people, a way specifically that Moses had said would set this people apart as a nation among all the nations of the earth. And later on, the apostles looked back and said, not only is that the case, but God's intention is what Paul says in Ephesians 3:10, was that now, through his called out people, he would make his manifold wisdom known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms. So, we keep seeing throughout the scriptures a greater expansion of the same purpose of God through his people. So what's interesting about this time of history in the life of God's people is, they've gone from being, from Abraham, where they were one, to he was the great father, and then he became, or would be called from Abram to Abraham, the father of many. And so this in itself is a revelation of God's purpose, that God has purposed to have many sons. But what we haven't seen yet is a real founding and stabilization of how God would do that. We've seen man's attempts to do it through the physical births. So we saw that with Abraham and Isaac, and Abraham and Ishmael, and that is used as an example later on in Scripture, as to the difference between the son of promise and the son of man's effort, man's own ways. So we see an attempt to reproduce, but we don't necessarily see the culture that was meant to be produced in and through the people of God. And so, It wasn't seen in the families. We had a lot of trouble. Each one of the patriarchs in many ways have had different troubles with different sons. We see all these examples with Jacob and Esau, and then with the sons of Jacob, which became the tribes of Israel. Jacob became Israel, and then they went into slavery, and they basically took on themselves a whole nother culture and worship of other gods and way of life. And this was all foreseen by God and foretold by God to Abraham. It was also shown to Moses that there would be rebellion. God showed Abraham the oppression and the deliverance. Moses was born as the deliverer and mediator for Israel, sent by God to call them out. And this is where we see the real a further clarity brought to God's purpose and intention for his people, for himself. And he says, tell Pharaoh that I'm calling them out to come into the wilderness or into the desert so that they can worship me, which we have looked into the word, which means serve my purposes. And so we still haven't seen the full development of God's purposes. But then once Israel is redeemed or saved out of Egypt, brought up out of Egypt, then God begins to reveal that purpose. So he says, here's why I'm doing what I'm doing in the way that I'm doing it, and here's what I want you to do and become. And so then we see this dispensation of the law given so that he can have a people for himself who live in a particular way. And so that when his ways are practiced in their midst as a people, then it will bear the fruit of his life in the world. But Israel's always rebelling against this, and they're looking at their temporary needs and their circumstances and the nations that surround them, and this is just this up and down cycle that continually happens with them. Yet God is still revealing his purpose and his name to them. And so, when they come to this place of rebellion, ultimately God will say, you know what, I'll start over. He'd already done this with Noah. And so he says again to Moses, I'm going to just destroy this people and I'll start over with you because of who you are and because of the way that you revere my name, fear my name. And, Moses intercedes and mediates between Israel and God. And God says, okay, then, I will tutor them with the law. But, the New Testament authors show us that where the law was perfect, the flesh was weak, and so it was not able to accomplish its purpose. So then we usher in, the time of Christ where Jesus fulfilled the law and opened up again that new and living way for what? Not just to be saved from sin or simply come to the Father and play our harps in heaven for eternity, but to fulfill the purpose of God here on earth, in creation. Something that has not yet been fulfilled yet. So jumping back here, even in this book in Samuel, we're going to see, and I had mentioned to you guys before, that we would see the constant or the consistent, let's say it that way, reminder of a nation who had been taken out of slavery, out of Egypt, and then into the land of promise. That's going to be mentioned again. And this all through the whole scriptures is not just a declaration of the events that God accomplished with the Israelites in Egypt, but a declaration of his purposes in mankind, yes, through the nation of Israel here. But what is God doing? Why does he always use this example? Well, because that meant something. It was symbolic of something. It was an actual event that were real people, real circumstances, real history there. But it meant something in the plan of God. It meant something it indicated something. It was a declaration of something, a revealing of something of God's purposes. To be taken out of the world, the kingdom of darkness, the gods of this world, the ways of this world, and into the purposes of God. But the world had become so ingrained in the lives of this nation that they couldn't seem to get it out of them. They were taken out of it, but they couldn't get it out of them. And so This, the Lord said, was what the time in the wilderness, that's the purpose. That's the purpose that it would serve in their life, that they would suffer the discipline of God. They would need to submit to the discipline of God in order to learn the essence of his ways. What we see, however, is a people who constantly rebel. And what we have is a picture of human nature, the fallen nature of man, the sinful nature of man, the fleshly ways of man, the wisdom of man that are directly juxtaposed to the wisdom of God and the ways of God. And one thing that we need to constantly apply in our own hearts and minds is the reality that that is the enmity that's going on in our own lives and hearts and minds between the ways of man, the ways of the world, the wisdom of the world, and the ways of God and the wisdom of God in us. So that is in many ways allegorical, but it doesn't mean that these were not actual events and real people in whom these things were being dealt with. But we would be very unwise to say, well, that was them and it's not that not that way anymore for us. We don't deal with that kind of thing because we have Jesus and he died and so everything's taken care of and everything's okay. So I will remind you again that what Jesus said specifically in relation to the law was this: I have not come to abolish the law, to do away with the law, but I have come to fulfill it. Okay? Let's think about that for a second. What does that mean? Let me tell you what it doesn't mean, because this is typically the way that it is thought. That Jesus obeyed every jot and tittle. So if we had a list on a piece of paper, he could put a righteous check mark off of every single one and say, I did that, therefore the law is fulfilled. We would be gravely missing the mark if that's what we think that Jesus did. If that's what we think that the perfection of his life was, or even if we didn't relate sinlessness to perfection, even if we thought that that was the sinlessness of his life, was that he would be able to put all the check marks on the list. That's not it. So what does it mean that Jesus fulfilled the law? It means, so let me say this as a side note. He did fulfill the righteous requirements of the law. He could put the righteous check mark on everything. But the true fulfillment was that the life of God, the wisdom of God, the ways of God bore fruit in his life as a son of God. But God's intention was not only ever to have one son, but to have many, to have a people, to have a family. So Jesus became an ensample of sonship so that many could become the family of God. And as the body, the congregation of his people, become a witness, a manifestation of the life and the purpose of God to the world and to the heavenly realms and to the angels and to the demons, to the rulers, the powers, to all created things. Now, that's where we know that God's purpose is heading. And what we're looking at here is the development of that purpose. And now we're going to see a transition in this development. Because now we're going to see the time where we have gone through, they've come out of Egypt, they've gone through the wilderness, they were surrounded by other nations, the Lord God was with them, he fed them, he protected them, he clothed them. Now he's brought them into the promised land. He's always kept his promises. We just read in Judges previously that he said, I've done everything that I said that I would do. Why haven't you done what you committed to do? Because everything that God said, he said, if you do this, if you follow my ways, if this is produced in your life, if you practice my law. Remember Deuteronomy? Take it with you. Talk about it at the table. Talk about it when you get up. Talk about it when you go to sleep. Talk about it when you sit down. Talk about it when you eat. Not just a discussion. Practice my ways. That's why James says faith without works is dead. You can believe it all day long. If you don't put it into practice, it has no value. That was never talking about a work salvation, that you have to work to be saved, because God's goal for mankind was not salvation. It was a people set apart for his own purposes. That's the goal. You have to be saved from your sin in order to be entered into that. Well, let's remember that before Israel went into the promised land, they were saved from Egypt, out of darkness, into the promise. But that's just the beginning. And it was after they were, quote unquote, saved, that they had to go through the wilderness to get the whole world out of them. So why in the world do we think today that being saved is the end of the game? Might as well die in the wilderness like the first generation of the Israelites. They never became a people. And we're going to see here that they never received God as their king. So why did we have the Judges cycle? Why did we see the big famine that happened when we read through Ruth? Why is there this constant up and down? Because the people never engaged and practiced and trained and reproduced and passed down the culture of God's house. They never even really learned it. Something that's always intrigued me through the Old Testament is to look at all these great men of God, Samuel included, as we will see. But there's even their own progeny, their own sons, don't follow in their ways. We even see that from the great King David, as we will see, to Solomon, there was something lost. Why? Chasing after the gods of this world, in whatever form or fashion that they may be. So we are going to see a transition coming. They're now in they're now in the promised land, but they're not living in the peace and prosperity that was promised by God. Why? Because God's unable to fill his promises? No. In the same way. Why? Because is this happening because the law is imperfect? No. It's because of the disobedience of the people, the unwillingness, the stiff-neck hard-heartedness of the people to submit and engage in the ways of God, in the culture of God's house. They won't even learn it. They're still living as slaves and orphans, scratching around for a living, for their existence. And it's not because they need to. God showed them that. Man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. This is the lesson I was trying to show you in the wilderness. You needed to learn it, so that when you come into the promised land and you have everything given to you, you don't think that you did it yourself. But they very quickly strayed. And that's not just the sin or the tendency of the Israelites. That's representative of each one. The prophets would say that later. All we have, like sheep, have gone astray. There is none righteous, no, not one. We've all done it. It's not a verse to make everybody think that, convince everybody that they've done their little sins. It's much bigger than that. We have missed the purpose of God entirely. I want us to see. Yes, there's some great stories in here. That's typically how the Old Testament's looked at. Man, there's a lot of great stories. No, there's something very significant happening here in terms of the fulfillment of God's purposes. There's a lot of development here. So this new development where we just went through Ruth, and where did Ruth leave us? It left us with the lineage of David, the great king of Israel, the man after God's own heart, and the greatest time of kingdom history that Israel ever had. Because it was David's kingdom whom God promised to maintain forever. But there was a reason for that. We're not going to get quite that far today, but I'm just going to putting a little picture out there. So where are we with Israel? What is going on? Well, Samuel, in reality, is another judge of Israel. Just as, we ended the judges. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. We saw that went all the way into the priesthood. We're going to see the very same thing here. So we're still in the time of the judges, but this is a transitory time because we're going to be moving from the rulers of Israel, the judges of Israel, into kingship. So there's a principal way of life that's going to be introduced through the kings, even though there's also a rejection that takes place. But God's going to use that to teach his people anyway. He's going to have someone that's representative of him as king, because Israel wouldn't receive him as king. So what's the current state? Lawlessness, no king, no God, hardly even a priesthood. Yet there is a remnant. Israel will reject God as king, desiring to be ruled as the nations around them. We're going to see that specifically. They never learn the culture of God. They don't maintain the culture of God, but they're looking around them again. They want something like that, they say. There's a big scale picture here. They would rather be engaged in and ruled by and governed by the powers from below than those from above. So they are pursuing the ways and the wisdom of man. As we move into looking at the lives of the kings, because that is much of what we will see in 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, even 1st, 2nd Chronicles, we're going to see another a picture of a life set apart as a king or a son, in God's dealings with such a person, specifically in David's life. Saul's also. So 1 Samuel begins with the story about the family of Elkanah, who was married. He had 2 wives, one Hannah, one Peninnah. And Hannah was barren, unable to bear child. Also, the priesthood is in an interesting state. Eli is in the position of the high priest, I believe. And his 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are some wicked guys. They do some pretty terrible things. At the entrance to the tent of meeting, they're doing this stuff. It's crazy. That's the current state of the priesthood. Now, we can see, again, in their names, some interesting things. They are the priest in Shiloh. His sons are doing these wicked things. Hophni means fighter, boxer, to fight with the fists. That's what his name means. And we actually see this brutality and force being used with the temple sacrifices. Basically, you're going to do this in this way, or I'm going to make you do it. I'm going to force you to do that. Phinehas, the name means mouth of brass, or it means the mouth of the serpent, hissing, divination. These are the names of 2 priests in the house of Israel. So these are some pictures of the condition. You can always see the condition of a nation when you see the condition of its leaders. And in the nation of Israel, the two entities to look at are the king, the king's house, and the priesthood. Kingship and the priesthood are 2 themes all throughout Scripture. Why? Well, God had said to his people, I will make you a nation of kings and priests. And that this same thing was developed, of which we will continue to develop as a purpose of God throughout the Scriptures. It was also written of and developed and taught by the apostles. What was God really going for here? You can always tell something about the people of a nation by looking at their leaders. So we are in Pretty terrible time. Still. Even though we're seeing a godly man come into play in Samuel's life. Verse 5 also introduces another theme in the scriptures that I'm going to point out and not necessarily go into a lot of detail about, but because it comes up very frequently in the scriptures, we'll point it out. Verse 5 says that his wife Hannah, it says to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her and the Lord had closed her womb. This is not just a principle of physiology that, God opens the womb and closes it, although that is true. The womb is indicative indicative to the what word am I looking for? The incubation and production place and birthing out of God's purposes. Do we see that? That the womb is not just the place where conception takes place and the baby is grown and then ultimately born out. It is that. It perfectly represents also the sowing in of God's purpose and the bearing out of his promise. So throughout the scriptures, this happens regularly with childbirth, promised childbirth. But it also directly parallels a spiritual reality, which is the birthing forth of God's purpose. We're going to see that throughout the scriptures. Truth works in this way. It is sown in as a seed, and then it needs to take root and begin to grow and mature. There's a lot of spiritual principle related to this. It also has to do with, in the womb of God's purpose, the bringing forth of God's people. Look at the prophets and how much is said from the beginning to the end of the scriptures about childbearing as an example of the bringing forth of God's people. The Son of God, the man-child. So keep that in your mind as we go through the scriptures, that the womb is very representative of the bringing forth of God's purpose. And God is the one who opens it and closes it. So physiologically it's true, spiritually it's true. So back to the story, we have this rivalry. This is also a part of the theme. The rivalry between the barren woman and the one who is able to give birth. What are they? What's the spiritual parallel? That the woman, Jerusalem, the mother, is unable to truly give birth to her two children, to the children of God. But the children of the wicked or of the enemy are many. Seeds sown bear much. So again, this ties over with the principle of the harvest. That there will be a revealing of who belongs to who in judgment. So this is all in relation to the ways and the purposes of God and his sons that are being born by his appointment, not only in the individual lives like we see here in Samuel and many other children before and after, but also the appointment of the sons of God in creation and in fulfillment of God's purposes. At the right time, Jesus Christ was born. At the right time, God will reveal his manifest sons. So looking back at the story, you guys have read it. Hannah gives birth to Samuel after promising his life. So he's a Levite, but she also here mentioned in verse 11 is basically the vow of the Nazarite. It says, He will be given to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. Chapter 2, and so Samuel is taken to the temple after he is weaned, and he is left there with Eli to be raised in the presence of the Lord. So without going through much detail, we're going to see a very distinct contrast made between Samuel's life and the life of Phinehas and Hophni in chapter 2. But right now, Samuel is being given, there's a lot to be said for the dedication of Elkanah and Hannah in giving their son over in this way. And it says that Samuel ministered before the Lord as a boy. He wore an ephod as a boy. That's pretty incredible. So we see Hannah's prayer of praise to the Lord, prophetic in many ways. We won't stay on the details of that prayer. We'll move on in the story as it continues in chapter 2 with Eli's sons. Now the contrast here is very interesting. If we read starting in verse 17, verse 12 says, Eli's sons were wicked men. They had no regard for the Lord. And these are priests. And then it talks about some of their detestable practices. Verse 17 says, the sin of these young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. So not only were they doing it themselves, they were leading others to do the same. This misleading is always considered to be a very high level offense to the Lord. Now here's this contrast that we see over the next few verses. But Samuel, so here's what they were doing, but Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy, wearing a linen ephod. Each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him, and she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. And Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, may the Lord give you children by this woman. And he did. So the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She conceived 3 sons and 2 daughters, Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. Pretty major contrast. Now here we go. Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing. He was like, why do you do these things? This is terrible. You need to stop doing that. I mean, you're sinning against God, not just against the people. Who in the world will intercede for you in this case? His sons, however, verse 25, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. And here we see this contrast again. And the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with men. That particular set of words, that a child or a boy is continuing to grow in wisdom and stature before God and men, is something that we see many times in Scripture and directly related to God's appointed one. We see it obviously in Jesus' life. We see it here in Samuel's life. And we've seen it in other lives as well. So interesting to see how those things repeat themselves throughout Scripture, but also in indicating the way that the Son of God is to grow and mature before God, and how and in what context, in His presence. So now we see the rebuke of the prophet that comes to Eli talking about his house. And in verse 30 of chapter 2 it says, therefore the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promised that your house and your father's house would minister before me forever. The house of Levi. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me. Those who honor me, I will honor. But those who despise me, we will be disdained. The time is coming when I will cut short your strength and the strength of your father's house. This is the house of Levi. The priesthood. This priesthood. So that there will not be an old man in your family line. Now this was also talking about Eli's physical heritage as well. And you will see distress in my dwelling. Although good will be done to Israel in your family line, there will never be an old man. Every one of you that I do not cut off from my altar will be spared, only to blind your eyes with tears, to grieve your heart, and all your descendants will die in the prime of life. So that was specifically speaking of Eli's family line. And what happens to your two sons? Now, this is key because there's sections of this prophetic word that are some talking about the house of Eli, some talking about the Levite priesthood, and some talking about this is in juxtaposition to the priesthood of Melchizedek or of Christ. And he said this will be a sign that this is what I'm doing, not only to your household, but within the context of the people of all history. What happens to your sons Hophni and Phinehas will be a sign to you. They will both die in the same day. Now, verse 35. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and my mind. That's a huge statement there in terms of what God is looking for. I will firmly establish his house, and he will minister before my anointed one always. That's a different priesthood. Then everyone left in your family line will come and bow down before him for a piece of silver and a crust of bread and plead, appoint me to some priestly office so that I can have food to eat. So one priesthood will serve the other. This was indicated in Abraham's life as well, because out of Abraham came ultimately the Levitical priesthood, and he came to Melchizedek and tithed to him. So we see that he was serving him in the previous generations. Some interesting things there. So this faithful priest and priesthood is pointing to Christ and the sons of God. Chapter 3, we're familiar with the story of the calling of Samuel in the night. One thing that I want to point out in the beginning of chapter 3:1, the boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare, a famine of the word of God, and there were not many visions. So Samuel was set apart in this way, that he heard the word of the Lord, and that he received this intimate instruction from the Lord. So then we also see the fulfillment of the prophecy that was just given to Eli and his family, which is part of what the Lord showed to Samuel that night when he spoke to him. So the last few verses of this chapter I want to look at, starting in verse 19. The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of his words fall to the ground. No idle word. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. The word of the Lord was rare, but he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. And Samuel's word came to all Israel. This is a picture of relationship between the Father and the Son for sure. So now we move into a whole different circumstance. Israel is at war with the Philistines. The Philistines are oppressing Israel. God purposed to bring judgment to the Philistines, but he's also teaching Israel. So they go to war, they lose men, and then in verse 3 it says, chapter 4, verse 3, when the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? I think that was the right question to ask. But their response, their action, was all wrong. See, they're going to use God for their purposes. This to me is very indicative of what we saw with the remember the priest that had idols in his house and made his own ephod and all that kind of stuff, and then they argued over the priest that was in Judges. This is very similar. Now they're using the ark of God in this way. So they really should have sought the Lord and said, why did we lose? What is going on? What's going on in our nation? What's wrong with our heart and our people and our ways? Why did the Lord bring defeat upon us today before the Philistines? But see, they already have a solution in their own mind. They'll use God. So it says this, let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that he or it may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies. That's presumption. We'll just have God do this for us in this way. So the people sent men to Shiloh. They brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim. And Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. When the ark of the covenant, see, this is interesting to me, because they bring the ark out, and the Philistines become fearful. Literally, the nation, this people, the Philistines, have more fear and reverence for the God of Israel than the people of Israel. Even when they defeat the Israelites and take the ark and all these other things happen, they show more fear and reverence for God than his own people do. Look what they say here. When they learned, verse 6, that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. A God has come into the camp. We're in trouble. Nothing like this has ever happened before. Woe to us. Listen to what the example they use. You see, God was using this example not just for the Israelites to know who they were and what God was doing. God was declaring his purposes to the whole world, to all creation, by what he did. Because look what they say here. They are the gods who struck the Egyptians down with all kinds of plagues in the desert. They remember what God did. So they say, well, be strong, let's fight. So they fought, they defeat the Israelites. Tens of thousands are killed in Israel, and the Ark of the Covenant is captured, and Eli's sons are both killed. So where were they? Well, they asked the right question, but they were still living and going about doing what they were doing in the wrong way. They weren't truly seeking God. They were using God. So the news comes back to Eli that Israel's lost in battle, that Eli's sons were killed, and that the ark has been captured. The death of Eli is interesting to me. Verse 18 says, when he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backward off his chair by the side of the gate. His neck was broken and he died, for he was an old man and heavy. Why would these kind of details be included here? Well, again, the leadership are very much representative of the condition of the people. They are stiff-necked, overweighted on, I don't know how to put this. If we were to equate this to the god of the stomach, then they have become fat with their selfish ways and stiff-necked. And God is indicating through this that he will break his people. In order that, see, God's not just wanting to punish. Why? There needs to be a standard of righteousness brought in so that his purposes can be fulfilled. So Eli and his sons have died. something that's also very indicative of this time. I mean, we're talking about a pretty terrible time in Israel's history, really. But we have this glimmer of hope through Samuel's life. So his daughter-in-law is with child. It was the wife of Phinehas. She heard that the ark of God had been captured and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead. She went into labor, gave birth. She was overcome by her labor pains, and as she was dying, the woman attending her said, "Don't despair, you've been given birth to a son." But it says she didn't respond or pay any attention. She named the boy Ichabod, which means the glory has departed. Because of the capture of the ark of God and the deaths of her father. She said, the glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured. What does this really mean spiritually? What's the glory of God? The shining light? The power? The miracles? It was the presence and purpose of God had been lost in the midst of his people. Do you see how, again, the names directly indicate the condition, the circumstance, spiritually, of God's people? God's wisdom, his law, the culture that he intended to produce in and through his people, his rulership over them as king, that purpose has departed. It's been taken away. It's like a broken covenant. Not that God broke, but his people. So chapter 5 and 6, we see the ark in the midst of the Philistines. It begins to wreak havoc. Interesting story there in chapter 5. They take the Ark of the Covenant into the temple of Dagon. Dagon means fish god or fish. Dag is a fish, so Dagon is the fish god. And the description of this god is that it was basically the body of a fish with the head of a man, head and hands of a man. Okay, so that's the imagery that's here. Interestingly, that standing statue, it was supposed to represent fertility, all these things that were worshipped by the ancient cultures. So picture it, okay? We have a statue or an idol, a very large statue and idol that is representative of certain things. Obviously, false gods being worshipped. It has the head of a man and the hands of a man. So what happens? They put the Ark of the Covenant in the temple with Dagon, and the next morning they come back and it's bowing down before God. So they stand it back up, and what happens? The head and the hands had been broken off. All that's left is what? It's just a fish. It's nothing. There's no God here. It's interesting that what was meant to separate this ideal God apart from something that it would have been normal, either a man or a fish, was the fact that it was a fish with a man's head. And that was exactly what was broken off, again, before the Ark of the Covenant. So, interesting. Just an interesting point there. But then there's these terrible things begin to happen amidst the people, and they basically start passing the Ark around, and everywhere the Ark goes, it causes these tumors, and rats come, and there's all this terrible things that are happening. So finally they say, good grief, we got to get rid of this thing. We're all going to die. So again, now interesting, yes, terrible things are happening, whatever, but again we see that this people, a foreign people, the Philistines, are showing more fear and reverence for God than his own people. How do we see that? Well, they go to their priest and they're like, the priests even say, well, you better treat this God with reverence and respect. You can't send it back empty-handed. We've got to please and fear and revere this God in this way. So they make a new cart, put the ark on the cart, and then they take it and they, put all these gifts in it and send it back. Seriously, these people are learning in better ways than the Israelites are at this point. In verse, where are we? In verse 6 of chapter 6, the priests say, why would you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh did? When he treated them harshly, did they not send the Israelites out so they could? He's like, man, we need to learn a lesson from them. So they take the ark and they send it out, and they do this little test, and they have these 2 mothering cows, knowing that and then they capture their calves, and they put their calves in cages because they know that the calves are going to be bleeding out, and that the mother cows are going to want to go take care of their calves. So they make those cows take the Ark of the Covenant back, because they're like, okay, if this is the real God, and if this was really the hand of God at work in this, then we'll know, because these cows will go straight to Israel, where they'll go back to their land, or they'll take the ark back to its place, rather than coming back and taking care of their own calves. And that'll be like a sign to us. That's exactly what happened. So again, they feared God because of it. They knew the hand of God in it. And that's taken back. So now, verse 13 in chapter 6, we are in the time of Pentecost, or the wheat harvest, just so that we can know where we are in light of the seasons and the harvests of Israel. Verse 13, now the people of Beth Shemesh, which was, Beth Shemesh was the allotment that was given to Joshua, the house of the sun. So the ark is coming back to the house of the sun during Pentecost. Pretty amazing timing here. God's timing is always divine. It always means something more than what is simply written there and taken in by knowledge. You know, there's a prophetic revelation here, because we had the glory depart, and now we have the presence of God in the ark coming back during Pentecost. So that was a foreshadowing of what actually took place on the day of Pentecost, when the Spirit of God was given in the New Testament at the birth of the church. So they saw the ark, they rejoiced at the sight, and then key act here, the cart came to a field of Joshua of Beth Shemesh, and there it stopped beside a large rock, and the people chopped up the wood of the cart, sacrificed the cows as a burnt offering to the Lord, and the Levites took down the ark of the Lord together with the chests containing the gold objects, and placed them on the large rock. And on that day the people of Beth Shemesh offered burnt offerings and made sacrifices to the Lord. The 5 rulers of the Philistines saw this, and they returned that same day to Ekron. So I point that out because we're going to see that when they go to bring the ark back into, Jerusalem, when David takes it in, that's when we see this terrible thing happen, which is kind of indicated here as well, because some of these guys opened up the ark and looked inside the ark, and they were killed by God. They were struck down by God for doing so. We also see that when Uzzah does the same thing, he touches the ark to keep it from toppling. Well, that's because the priests weren't carrying it like God ordained the priests to do. That's the way the ark of the covenant of God was to be carried. It's the way it was to be moved. It's the way that it was to go from one place to another, was to be carried by the priests of God. So we see that they took it off the cart in this way, but when they go to move it, we'll look at that point. So chapter 6 ends with this terrible event. They look into the ark, many die, and then the fear of God is put in everyone, and they say, who can stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God? To whom will the ark go up from here? So people, then they're really afraid of God. So they send messengers to Kiriath-Jearim saying, Philistines have returned the ark. Please take it to your place. So they're afraid of it too. And they took it to Abinadab's house on the hill and consecrated Eleazar, his son, to guard the ark of the Lord. Samuel then goes on to pursue the Philistines. And then he comes back after defeating them. What am I looking at? I think that it was interesting. There's some other little sub-theme here that I had noticed in terms of the rock and the ark, because it was interesting to me that Noah's Ark was set on the high rock of Mount Ararat, and then the rock is representative of Christ and the foundation, and the ark is now being put on this. We also saw that that was the place where Abraham was instructed to take Isaac, not the same rock per se, but there's some symbolism here and imagery that is there. And then after this defeat, then Samuel comes back, and in verse 12 he says, he took a stone and he set it up as a witness. And so there was a witness there for the rock. These rocks, the stone, of God's purpose. Jesus Christ himself is declared to be the cornerstone and the capstone. So there's always a correlation here when we're talking about the stone of remembrance, the stone of stumbling, the stone that crushes, the stone that's a witness against, the stone that is the rock that is the Christ, the building up of the living stones of the building in the temple of God, the altar that's made of stones that are not cut by the hands of men. This is all a theme here. Verse 12, so Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shen, and he named it Ebenezer, saying, thus far the Lord has helped us. So God is still about fulfilling his purposes. Why has God helped them? That's what I want to ask. Well, because God is still, he has a promise and a covenant to his people to have them become something, even in the midst of the rebellious and unbelieving ways. So now we move into chapter 8. We have just seen that Samuel continues to rule as a judge in Israel and as a prophet. But 8:1 says, when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges for Israel. Now this is where that kind of interesting thing that I see throughout the Old Testament comes, and it's that we have a righteous man, but the righteous heritage is not passed down. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But, verse 3, his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, and they accepted bribes and perverted justice. So they didn't walk in the ways of their father. Then, there's two things that happen here. One, something that's been brewing in the nation the whole time, which is that they would not serve God as their king, serving the purposes of God. They also look around and they see the kings of the nations around them. Verse 20 in chapter 8 says, then we will be like all the nations around us. Okay? They also see that Samuel's sons did not walk in the ways of God, in the ways that Samuel did. And so the elders of Israel gather and they say, we don't want to have your sons as judges, so give us a king. So this is a personal offense to Samuel, but then the Lord says, it's not you that they're rejecting. There's something greater going on here. They've rejected me. So he says that in verse 7, and the Lord told him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It's not you that they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. So here's this example again. As they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, so they are doing to you. They rejected me, my ways, my purposes, my plans. They haven't done it. But warn them, this is what a king will do. This is how a king will treat them. So they looked around them. They saw that these other nations, the Amorites in particular, had a great king who was able to lead his people out in battle and have victory. So they said, and that's exactly what they're going for, verse 20, we'll be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles. How many psalms, how many of the prophetic words of the prophets talk about the Lord who is strong in battle, the Lord who is mighty in battle? But no, they want a man. They want a man to lead them to fight their battles. The wrong battles. The wrong war. The wrong culture. So God says, give them a king. And Samuel says, you've asked for it, you've rejected God and his purposes, so God is giving you a king. Chapter 9, we see the introduction to Saul and his life. He was a humble man of the tribe of Benjamin, loses his donkeys, goes out. The Lord sets up this whole thing for them to meet. Samuel anoints Saul as king and then sends him off. Saul, there's many signs and wonders that are attached to this. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon Saul. He prophesies with others. All the words of again, Samuel's, not one of his words ever fell to the ground, right? So exactly what Samuel says happens. He prophesies, and then he comes back to Saul and says, okay, we're gonna consecrate you as king, and meet me in Gilgal. Gilgal is what he says at the end of chapter 10 and verse 8. We also see a theme with Saul's life in particular in verse 9 of chapter 10, where it says this, and Saul, as Saul turned to leave Samuel, God changed Saul's heart, and all the signs were fulfilled that day. Something that we see is God working within the heart of a man every time. So this is juxtaposed to David, who was a man after God's own heart, and Saul, who really had kind of a half heart. So he started off well. He did some good things. He was valiant for the Lord. We see that he rescues the city of Jabesh in chapter 11. Then he's confirmed as king. The people are very excited that they have this very fine, tall, strong young man to be the ruler. He's wonderful on the outside. He has a great appearance. They're happy to have him as a king. But the way that God is received into the heart of this man is very different than what we will see in the life and the heart of David. So chapter 12 we're going to look at closely, and then we'll finish up. Samuel said to all Israel, I have listened to everything that you said to me and have set a king over you. Now you have a king as your leader. As for me, I'm old and gray, and my sons are here with you. I have been your leader from my youth until this day. So he says, I've never taken anything from you. I've never cheated. They say, you're right. Now verse 5. The Lord is a witness against you. And also his anointed is a witness this day, that you have not found anything in my hand. He is a witness. Then Samuel said to the people, verse 6, it is the Lord who appointed Moses and Aaron and brought your forefathers up out of Egypt. Do you see how often this comes up? Keep paying attention to that, because it's a declaration of God's purpose. Why did God do that? To what end? To produce what? To do what with this people? So that's why it's always given as an example. By God, by his prophets. It's always a declaration of his purpose. Now then, stand here, because I'm going to confront you with evidence before the Lord as to all the righteous acts performed by the Lord for you and your fathers. What was God doing? What was God about? What was he wanting to produce? So here's the story. After Jacob entered Egypt, they cried to the Lord for help, and the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your forefathers out of Egypt and settled in this place. You were saved out of something and into something, but you haven't become what you were meant to be. But they forgot their Lord. So he sold them into the hand of Sisera, the commander of the army of Hazor, into the hands of the Philistines, the king of Moab, who fought against them. They cried out to the Lord and said, we've sinned, we've forsaken the Lord, and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. But now deliver us from the hands of your enemies, and we will serve you. So that's the judge's cycle. Oppression, saving, up and down, up and down. So the Lord sent up Jerubbaal, Barak, Jephthah, and Samuel, and he delivered you from the hands of your enemies on every side, so that you live securely. But when you saw Nahash, king of the Amorites, moving against you, you said to me, no, we want a king to rule over us. Even though the Lord your God was your king. Now, I wonder how Saul was feeling about this part. Now here's your king that you have chosen, the one you asked for. See, the Lord has set a king over you. Even so, the mercy of God is here. If you fear the Lord and serve and obey him and do not rebel against his commands. What? Follow his ways, his laws. He's giving them another opportunity. And if both you and the king who reigns over you follow the Lord your God, good. But if you do not obey the Lord, and if you rebel against his commands, his hand will be against you as it was your forefathers. Now then stand still, listen and see the great thing the Lord is about to do before your eyes. Is it not wheat harvest now? So here we are again, the time of Pentecost. I will call upon the Lord to send a thunder and a rain, and you will realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king, when you rejected God as your king. What is he doing? Well, we think, well, maybe rain's a good thing. No, the rain, the thunder came and it destroyed the wheat harvest. This is not a good thing. So he called upon the name of the Lord. Same day the Lord sent a thunder and a rain, so that all the people stood in the awe of the Lord and of Samuel. And then they cried out, we're going to die. We can't survive without the harvest. For we've added to all of our other sins. Do not be afraid, verse 20. Samuel replied, you have done all this evil, yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. Serve the purposes of God with a whole heart, as Caleb did, as Joshua did. Have a whole heart from God. Don't turn aside to useless idols. They can do you no good. They can't rescue you. For the sake of his great name. Why has God done this? Not because you're righteous people. Not because you have repented. Not because there's something good in you. But because of his great name. Because of the fulfillment of his intentions and purposes. That's why. The Lord will not reject his people, because the Lord was pleased to make you his own. As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord and fail to pray for you. And I will teach you the way that is good and right. But be sure to fear the Lord and serve him, his purposes, faithfully, with all your heart. Consider what great things he has done for you. Blessing and curse. Yet, if you persist, keep on doing. Same thing said by the New Testament authors. Doing evil. Both you and your king will be swept away. Now we see the downhill slide of Saul. A different perspective than we will a very different perspective than we will see in the life of David. Saul goes out against the Philistines. He has so many men. Samuel said, wait for me, because this is about what the Lord is doing, not about what man is doing in his intentions. So Saul's waiting for Samuel. He waits a while. He's not coming. And then his men start to get nervous, and some of them start to leave. And he's sitting there counting, whoa, we don't have enough to win this battle. Totally different perspective. What we will see in David's life is that he waits upon God and just says, should I do this or should I not? He waits upon the Lord, and then he does exactly what the Lord says. And the Lord's always true. Saul is looking on the outside. He does the right, quote unquote, the right thing in his own eyes. Well, I'll still sacrifice to God. I'll still make the offering. So he was obedient, right? But he didn't do it in God's way. He did the right thing in the wrong way, which was the wrong thing. So he is rebuked by Samuel. Verse 13 of chapter 13, you have acted foolishly, Samuel said. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. Two different ways of life, two different cultures, two different kingdoms. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. Speaking of David, yes, also speaking of Christ and the sons of God. So they go to war. Saul makes this foolish promise. Jonathan, we see in chapter 14 a very different view. He's looking to God to see whether he can see. For Jonathan, it's not about the numbers at all. It's about the word of the Lord. So Israel defeats the Philistines. Saul makes this foolish thing saying that, declaration saying that no one can eat any food, which is crazy because all the soldiers are about to die of exhaustion. And he's telling them they can't eat. So then they start to dishonor God by eating meat with blood still in. All these things happen. Jonathan eats, breaking this promise that Saul made. And the people keep him, Saul that is, from killing his son Jonathan for breaking the covenant because of the valiant things that he has done. And then in chapter 15, which where we will end today, we see that the Lord completely rejects Saul as king. Sends them into battle. He says everything must be dedicated to the Lord. Do not live anything. But he decides, oh, you know what? Me and my men chose to keep all the choice cattle, and then he kept the king alive too. And so the Lord comes through Samuel. We're going to look in verse 22 of chapter 15. It says this. Let's jump back for just a second. Look what Saul says in 13. When Samuel reached him, Saul said, "The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions." And Samuel says, then why do I hear sheep? And why is this king here? Oh, we were going to dedicate that to God. A full deviation from the commands of God. So, verse 22, Samuel replied, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice, the command, the teachings, the ways of the Lord?" To obey, very popular scripture, is better than sacrifice. To heed, to listen, to put into practice is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. So Saul now comes and he repents, but Samuel says to him, "I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king of Israel." And as Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe, and it tore. Everything is with consequence in the Lord. And Samuel said to him, "So the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man that he should change his mind." So he repents again, Saul does, and Samuel goes back to worship with him. And then he kills King Agag, as Saul should have done. Verse 34, then Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to his home in Gibeah. Until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him. And the Lord was grieved that he had made Saul king over Israel. So we will finish there today. Obviously, next week we will start into the life of David. And let's read through. Well, I think it'll be good to go ahead and read the rest of Samuel. I'm not sure if we'll get through it completely because we may need to take a little bit more time to look through and at the life of David. But let's go ahead and finish reading 1 Samuel for next week. Thank you guys for your time.